So the first 3 lectures in this series on television are about the essay's first half. And that's really what it is. It's an essay. This ain't a book, even though it's published in a book form. That's milking it if you ask me. This is an essay, and it's a damn good essay. We got 3 lectures to walk you through the first half of this essay. The final round of lectures, starting now, deal with the second half of this essay, which I'm delighted to report I read and really enjoyed. What I discovered, though, was that in order to make sense of the second half of this essay, I had to go back and reread the first. And weirdly enough, had to come up with 2 lectures just on the first half again. Sections 1 through 4 of television. Part 1 begins now. First and foremost, one of the recurring themes here is language. And Lacan is explicit. It's rare in this text that you see him mention language and not tie it to the word structure. When Lacan says structure in television, he means language, and vice versa. Specifically, the type of language in question here is language out of Lacan, as he puts it on page 8 of our translation. Now, language, you heard me say, in the opening lecture of this series, quoting Lacan from Seminar 20, language is what we try to know about Lacan. It's enunciated knowledge, in which some, but not all, Lacan is captured, crystallized, commodified, quantified, calculated, all the things we do with those chiffres. In short, it's where Lacan is linguistified. To even call language enunciated knowledge, however, I think is to mischaracterize that shit, or at least to start to mischaracterize language. Why? Because, as you've heard me say, again echoing Lacan from Seminar 20, our enunciated knowledge of Lacan is so severely limited and limiting, but also, paradoxically, we'll see, enabling and even inviting, as to qualify as ignorance. Hence, linguistery, or as I prefer, linguistrickery, ignorance, knowledge be thy name. Don't believe me? Just ask a linguist. They'll be the first to paper over our ignorance of Lacan with what we know about language, and what they would love you to set aside 20 minutes at the party for them to tell you all about. Here again, when I say ignorance, I am not talking about learned ignorance, which is without a doubt knowledge's most radical state. I'm talking about ignorance in its old school Latin form, from in meaning not and naris meaning aware or acquainted with. You see, in learned ignorance, we become aware of and acquainted with the limits of our own knowledge. And say what you will about the start of German idealism, this was all Kant was up to, ever trying to find the limits of knowledge and reason. And if you ask me, this was what was destined to become the fourth critique, had there been more time in the old-timer's life. A critique of religion within the limits of reason alone, in order, as Kant told the authorities, to know where reason ends and where faith should begin. That's a very important illustration of learned ignorance in a tradition that in many ways brought us to Lacan. So when I say ignorance here, I ain't talking about that working within one's limits that you are constantly pushing at and becoming aware of. I'm talking about basic bitch ignorance. When linguistery, linguistrickery prevail, It's that basic bitch ignorance that we see. Because we mistake the limits of our knowledge for lines of completion. We mistake the limits of our knowledge for markers of complete knowledge, for markers of epistemes without lack. That's a very slippery move, but also an integral one to what happens when learned ignorance gets papered over by basic ignorance. This is why I think Lacan says that language is knowledge's harebrained lucubration about la langue. What an absurd, ridiculous, wildly ignorant endeavor, if you think about it, to try and capture, crystallize, and commodify la langue in language. And how ridiculous when we pretend it's anything but this harebrained lucubration. But wait a minute. You've heard all of this from me before. Why on earth am I rehearsing this bit about language out of la langue yet again? Several reasons, and this is where our pen hits the paper, or in this case, the blackboard. Because this bit about language out of la langue is crucial to understanding what Lacan is doing with the unconscious. And I write it on our board so you can have it before you. And not just the unconscious, but that which it commands, the symptom. And between them both, as you damn well know at this point, the real, or at least its points of access. What appears between symptom and unconscious is not, technically speaking, the real, but its name, its threshold, a place where we can begin to touch upon it, a point of access, as Lacan is increasingly calling it at this point. It's an access point that we see between the unconscious and the symptom. I'll write the real up here, but I want you to know that what we're really talking about is a logical impasse that allows us to touch on the real, but it ain't the real itself, if we could even say as much. But here's the main thing, as I've got this list generating again. When we think hard about language out of la langue, we learn about the unconscious, the symptom, and the points of access to the real that mark their differential relation. And all especially in analytic discourse. And especially insofar as analytic discourse functions as what Lacan on page 28 of Television describes as the game of love. So what I'm going to add to this list then is the analytic discourse, but particularly this bit about the game of love, which is all we ever play in analysis. So why does it matter to keep language out of la langue on our horizon? Because it helps us understand the unconscious, the symptom, the points of access to the real that divide them, and all three of these elements popping in an analytic discourse, characterized, typified by games of love. These, it seems to me, are our clinical and conceptual waypoints in this final round of lectures, and that's partly why I write them up on the board for you. Let's start at the beginning with the unconscious. Recall, if you will, what we've learned so far. Speaking beings, and only speaking beings, have an unconscious. The unconscious speaks through these beings, But let's be more precise with this. The medium through which the unconscious speaks is not just the human form, the human body, but more specifically, the body carved up by language, as Lacan tells us in television. Carved up into one part corporal and one part linguistic, we might start by saying. This is the medium through which the unconscious speaks, a body carved up into corporal and linguistic parts. If you ask me, this is all Section 2 of television is about. Have another read. But it's this second part, not the corporal part, but the linguistic part into which our bodies are carved, that Lacan carries forward from Section 2 to the end of television. Let's see if we can keep up with him as he pursues the linguistic part of the body carved up by language. First, a quote. The unconscious speaks, which makes it dependent on language, Lacan tells us on page 5. And here, note, I'm translating from the original French text, which reads, at least for me, much clearer than what we see on page 5 in the English. And you don't have to have French to do this. You can take the French text and run to your translator app and run it through a few times. Ask a large language model to help you retranslate some of this stuff. It's interesting, the alternate translations you get. You don't have to be fluent in French to do this work. I, as ever, am living proof of that. But note the phrase here, note the structure, note where Lacan begins. The unconscious speaks, period. What does that mean? It means that it is dependent, at least in part, on language. If it speaks, it's dependent on language. Pretty straightforward, right? This is the conceptual foundation on which he's going to build. And with this foundation laid, this guy gets right to work. Indeed, he is off to the races as soon as that gate is opened. On page 28 of television, Lacan gets a little more specific, which I appreciate. He further specifies what he means by this. The unconscious, he tells us, is motivated by language in such a way that causes it to exist relative to language, allowing it to insist there, but only from without, as an extimate limit wandering errantly through the fields of language. Discourse, you've heard me say, is not language, but it is linguistic. Discourse, for Lacan, is the specific logico-mathematical structure within language, within the broader field of language, that allows us to locate, by which I mean to find, but also to place, the errant, extimate, existent agency of the unconscious, and to witness that motherfucker at work. Discourse is where we locate the unconscious as an errant, extimate, existent agency wandering through the field of the symbolic. So let's ask the question, what exactly do we witness when we witness the unconscious at work? Well, we see a certain know-how, savoir-faire, Lacan tells us in Seminar 20, especially when it comes to la langue. The unconscious knows how to do things with la langue. So check it out. The unconscious, that unknown field of knowledge, is a know-how relative to la langue. It knows how to do things with Lacan, things in excess of conscious intent, but only through the discourse of its possessor. And ever, my friends, in the shape of a symptom. What this errant, extimate existence known as the unconscious does when it speaks, it does in the form, or better, with the effect of symptomatic statements. A body carved up by language. This is what speaks, what is saying in an embodied, lived, corporal act of speaking. But note this, it's a symptomatic statement that is said. There's a key distinction here between the saying, dir, and the said, d, at this point in Lacan's thought. When the unconscious finds expression, you see a body carved up by language speaking. But what is said as a result of this corporal event is a symptomatic statement. Note this distinction, I think it's key, between, once more, corporality and language. Corporality points to the lived, embodied act of saying. Language, though, that linguistified part of the body carved up, points to the lexical, meaningful effect of having said something. And that's the difference here. Corporality directs us to the lived, evental act of saying. Language, that which lacerates the body, points us to the lexical, meaningful effect of having said something along the way. You see, there's what my body is doing right now with lips, tongue, breath, voice, and so on. This is not meaning-making that you're hearing right now, but what Lacan in television calls jouissance, enjoyment. Note Lacan at work here. That's what's happening right now in the act and fact of saying that you are hearing with your ears, and if you're watching it on the screen, seeing with your eyes. If there's any meaning to this act of saying in which I'm engaged right now, it's only going to arrive later, in a hearing turned interpreting. And in French, don't forget, the words are the same. To hear and to interpret for Lacan are closely related to each other. Which is why we've spent so much time with that saying that Lacan has been trotting around since Seminar 19B, or worse, writing on the board, not explaining, and then founding l'étourdi on it. The saying, as I'm sure you've heard me say, goes like this. The act of saying is forgotten behind what is said in what is heard. That's what we've got our finger on here. Now, l'étourdi is the key spot to explore this insight. Indeed, the title alone, at least as I translated it in our series on the essay, says it all. How do you translate l'étourdi? Put that through your ChatGPT. The way I like to translate it, as you probably know, is the forgetful said. Here, in television, we see the broader language theoretical context in which to situate the difference between saying and said, dir and d, in Lacan's clinical and conceptual work. But note this, It's the said, more than the act of saying, that has caught our boys' attention in television. And by said, again, I mean the symptom, not as an event, but as an effect, not as a saying, but as a said, a statement. When the unconscious speaks, hear me now, the symptom is what is said. The unconscious speaks through bodies. Don't get it twisted. Bodies engaged in corporal acts of saying. But note this, it speaks with the linguistic effect of symptomatic statements. Or, put a bit more archly, but also, I believe, more precisely, symptomatic saids. This, I think, is precisely what we see in the analytic discourse, when we follow the vectors from S2 to /S to S1. And I'll draw it up here on the board again so we can have it in front of us. The analytic discourse. You know what's wild? Just the other day, in fact, just yesterday, we had the first live online discussion of television. A lot of you were there. Many more of you were not. By the time you're listening to this, watching this, and so on, yeah, if you haven't attended one of these discussions, you got to get in on this. I can't emphasize this enough. We were at it for 4.5 hours. People took lunch breaks and came back, and we were still chopping it up. I stay as long as I don't piss my pants. That's the general rule. And as long as there are questions, we keep going. And yesterday's discussion was lit right out of the gates, just like Lacan moving forward from section 2 in television, right out of the gates. Very impressive stuff. Clinicians, trainees, scholars, students, startling amounts of insights, many of them centered around the analytic discourse, which I'm drawing on the board right now for you one more time. Won't be our last, but I like to say one more time. And I'm drawing it in green with all the vectors because I think this color of green is just lovely. But you know I want to use a different color for that delta of impotence raised to the level of impossibility that we see between S2 and S1. Here, though, what I'm asking you to take note of is in analytic discourse, when we follow S2 up to /S and then down to S1, we see exactly what it is we're talking about here. One step at a time, say it again, say it better. What do we mean by S2 at this point in our conversation? Simple. S2 here is the analysand's unconscious truth. Period. We can just leave it at that for now. And /S, through which S2 passes en route to the production of a symptomatic statement, this is a good one. Here you see your classic Lacanian subject, neurotic through and through, that split subject, that body carved up by language, you heard me say. And thus, as a result of being carved up by language, capable of speech and thought, but only ever in varying degrees of deliberateness and deliberation. Deliberateness and unawareness. Intention and slippage alike. And here I'm just cribbing from the person whom I believe is the world's second greatest reader of Freud, Kenneth Burke, the 20th century literary critic. I've brought him up before. If you haven't checked out his books on motive, I'm talking about his grammar of motives, but especially his rhetoric of motives. And then later, like Kant at the end of things, we get this kind of trickling out of what was to become a symbolic of motives, and perhaps even one more beyond it. But his rhetoric of motives is great because it captures the way that the split subject is able to speak and think, but only ever in what he calls varying degrees of deliberateness and unawareness. It's a terrific way to understand the type of speech and thought that typifies psychoanalytic theory and experience. And again, just as we've been saying it, all coming from a subject that is one part corporal and one part linguistic, and probably many parts of any different type. But corporality and language are the two biggies for us. And they've been this way for Lacan for a very long time. Isn't this what we mean at root when we talk about the difference between the enunciating and the grammatical subject? Corporality and enunciating, language and grammar. And here, always and forever, the split subject divided between these two. In other words, where these two parts have gathered, there will always be a third. So the math for the barred, classic, neurotic Lacanian subject is the math you know all too well at this point. 1 + 1 = 3. Because between enunciating subjectivity and its grammatical counterpart, there has to be a minimum irreducible difference. Otherwise, you wouldn't have either. Which brings us to that S1, which is effected by unconscious truth as it passes through this barred speaking subjectivity. S1 here is the symptomatic statement, that symptomatic said. Not the act of saying, but what is said as a result of this act. So we can kind of start to define some of this stuff. S2, we can just simply call it unconscious truth. S1, we can call it symptomatic said. And if you're just listening to this, which it's fine if you do, but I don't encourage it. If you've got the blackboard in front of you, you can see that I'm actually writing in all of these details so that as things build, we can have this in front of us as a model that you can return back to. Don't forget, that is also what these logico-mathematical structures known as discourse are designed to do for Lacan. These are teaching aids. These are resources to help the transmission of Lacanian theory and technique. The analytic discourse isn't just an algorithmic structure that is built up around an impasse, the impasse that I now dot for you to recall. They are also teaching aids. These are like little cheat sheets to have in front of you as you start to think through analytic experience, at least in part. These aren't just abstract, mathematical, discursive structures for Lacan. They are simply resources to help his teaching undergo transmission. But note this, the S1 in question here is a symptomatic said, not the act of saying, which produced this said. And if we wanted to locate that act of saying, just to kind of keep your eyes on it, I usually put it somewhere in between the barred subject through which the unconscious speaks and the symptomatic statement that is effected as a result. Somewhere in between that barred subject carved up by language and the symptomatic statement that they produce is an act and fact of saying. You can't have a symptom that's a statement or a said without a precursive act of saying. No saying, no said. So it's going to be somewhere in between there. which is why I put the red dot on your screen, so you can remember, but also note that what we are talking about now is S1 as a symptomatic said, which is relevant to the act of saying, as we're going to see, but ultimately distinct for Lacan. What are we to make of this distinction? How are we to understand this symptomatic result that is something said and effected by an act of saying? This, it seems to me, is one of two key questions in television: how to handle the S1 in the analytic discourse. Recall the second lecture in this series. In the second lecture, I told you the symptom has the form of a saying turned said, but it has the content of la langue, which I defined as the part of one's unconscious truth that can be said by way of embodied evental acts of saying. I'm just walking this yellow vector on your screen right now. Up to this point, I've also told you that there are two basic ways to respond to symptomatic expressions in analytic experience. And here I'm just building right out of Lacan's early 1970s thought. Two basic ways to handle that symptomatic said. First, and unfortunately all too often, you can rush at symptomatic statements with meaning and ever in search of more. Thankfully, that's not the only option. Another way to handle symptomatic statements is to inquire about the acts and facts of saying, the embodied co-present speech events that preceded these symptomatic statements, and all too often remain forgotten behind them. Now, at long last, you see the relevance of Lacan's saying. The act of saying is forgotten behind what is said. That's crucial here. Another method for dealing with the symptom is to ask about what it forgets. Again, that's why I translate l'étourdi as the forgetful said. What hath thou forgotten, dear symptom? The clinical implications of these two approaches to the symptom are profound, and I think they're crucial to Lacan's work in this period. Both of these options are on clear display, if you ask me, in television. And I think they're directly in line with Lacan's understanding of that speaking unconscious as it relates to language. And here I mean language in all of its aspects: linguistic, linguistic, logico-mathematical, discursive, and so on. The fun, if you ask me, begins on page 7. And don't forget, this is the first of a flourish of lectures on the essay's second half. And here we are, cracking the book on page 7. In other words, in the essay's first half. As Lacan puts it there are, insofar as the unconscious is implicated, two sides presented by the structure, by language. So you want the unconscious involved in the sociolinguistic field, you got to think about language along two sides, Lacan tells us. Side one, he continues, is that of meaning. And it corresponds with option one that I just presented to you in terms of dealing with the symptom. You can rush at the symptom with meaning and ever in search of more. When the symptom pops up, the analyst can rush at it with meaning of their own. Yet another way to define that S2, here with its northward vector pointing at the analyst's position. Here we're not talking about unconscious truth, but the truth of the unconscious, as the analyst thinks they have it. This is among the meanings with which the analyst can rush at the symptom. And if you wanted to draw this one again, we absolutely can. I'll use a different color again for clarity. Here, where S2 pops up to little a in the analytic discourse, you see all the meanings that the analyst thinks they have in their back pockets. Meanings relative to not unconscious truth, but the truth of the unconscious. The analyst is the motherfucker who thinks he or she knows how the unconscious works, and who all too often tries to bring that knowledge, to leverage that knowledge onto symptomatic statements. This is very common. And I'm telling you, just as recently as yesterday, I heard a seasoned, established clinician, I won't say what their training is because I don't want to incriminate anything, saying that this is mostly how they deal with symptoms. They ask, how does that symptom fit into what I know about the unconscious? You see, that's what you see in the lower left-hand corner of the analytic discourse. This is knowledge, S2, in a position of truth. Knowledge raised to the status of a truth. The analyst thinks they have the truth of the operational logics of the unconscious. And that's what they show up with in their back pocket, rushing at the symptom and asking, how does this fit with the truth that I have? Or better, how can I make it fit or ignore it altogether relative to the truth in my back pocket? Now, maybe your analyst is better than that. Maybe they've hystericized you to do this work for them. Whether it's the analyst or the analysand, the logic here is the same. When you rush at symptoms with meanings already in your head or in your back pocket or on the bottom of your shoe, wherever you keep yours, that's a very specific approach to language use at this limit, which is what symptomatic speaking is. It's language use at its limit, second only to mathematics. This is what we learned from seminar 18. So whether it's you or your analysand, the logic is the same. We rush at the symptom with meaning in hand and ever in search of more to fill the other. Again, though, thankfully, this ain't the only approach, and Lacan says as much. You have the side of meaning, and then you have that which is opposed to it, that which the unconscious opposes to the side of meaning. Side 2, in the schema that Lacan starts cracking open on page 7 of Television, Lacan tells us that it is the side of the sign. And I'm telling you that it corresponds to option 2 that I just presented, where you look at the symptomatic said and inquire after the act of saying that is forgotten behind it. That is in keeping with Lacan's approach at the level of the sign in Television. More than the embodied act of speaking and its function as the wail of an appeal to the real, however, I think that Lacan is after something a little differently. Remember what I told you. He's not exactly honed in on the embodied, lived, corporal act of speaking in Television. He's more interested in what is said as a result, in the symptom as a product. You see, that's what you see in the analytic discourse. S1 is in the position of product. It's what's produced, effected by the analytic discourse. It's not the only thing, but it's primarily the product with which we begin. The symptomatic said. And this is what captures Lacan's attention more than the act of saying that preceded it in Television. I think this is readily apparent when Lacan says that he is after, and I quote, the pure signifying dimension of the symptom, by which, of course, he means Lalong. And notice how I emphasize that dimension. That's relevant here, spelled D-I-T, mention, because it has to do with the said, spelled D-I-T, mention. I write it on the board so you can see with your eyes what I'm also spelling out for your ears. It's this pure signifying dimension of the symptom that has his focus, and ours as well, because it's right here that we see Lalong really popping. You see, it's not linguistic meaning that interests Lacan about symptomatic statements. What interests him about symptomatic statements is that they are sonic ciphers. They are messages encoded in sound. And they require us, if you recall from our series on Seminar 20, to read with our ears. We're not talking about speech here. We're talking about its sounds, the meanings of which are rangy beyond comprehension, vast, enormous, disparate, heteroclite beyond lexical analysis. These are what must be read. And by read, here I mean deciphered. What, then, is the symptom for Lacan in television? It's a knot of signifiers, as he puts it, held together by phenomena of equivalence, established and sustained by their sounds when spoken. In short, their pronunciations. What is the symptom? It is a knot of signifiers held together by sonic equivalences. Sonic equivalences at the acoustic level of language that are established and sustained when we pronounce. Here, we are talking about verbalizations linked together, not by meaning, but instead by what Lacan once more calls jouissance, enjoy-ment, M-E-A-N-T. It's a perfect illustration of how Lalong operates. This coinage, jouissance, Jouis-S-E-N-S, sounds exactly like jouissance. You see? Enjoyment sounds exactly in English like enjoyment. And it wonderfully illustrates what we're talking about here, namely homophony, homophony, homonymy, homophony, homophony. You see? This is among the basic operational logics of Lalong. It's about sonic reverberation between signifiers when spoken. But I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves here. For real, though, we haven't even looked at page 7. I told you we're starting on page 7. I'm already messing around with page 8, 9, and the like. Let's just take this slow. And I don't want to get ahead of ourselves either, so let's make sure we stay on point. I think we should take these two sides, that of meaning on the one hand and that of the sign on the other, one at a time, just as Lacan presents them. So first, no more fucking around. Let's actually grab the book. Crack yours to page 7. And you'll see at the bottom of the page the phrase that I gave you from Lacan. He says there are, insofar as the unconscious is implicated, two sides presented by the structure. And again, by that he means language. It's right there at the bottom of page 7. The final line on page 7 is his introduction to the side of meaning, the one I was just telling you about that corresponds to that first option you have when dealing with a symptom. You can rush at it with meaning. Notice how Lacan presents this issue. The side of meaning, the side we would identify as that of analysis, but check this out, which pours out a flood of meaning to float the sexual boat. It is striking, Lacan continues, that this meaning reduces to nonsense, the nonsense of the sexual relation, something that love stories have throughout time made obvious to the point of stridency, which gives a lofty picture of human thought. There is, moreover, meaning that is taken for good sense, that even asserts itself as common sense. This is the high point of comedy, except that in comedy, awareness of the non-relation involved in getting it off sexually, must be included. Thereby, our dignity is recharged, even relieved. Good sense, in the form suggestion takes, comedy, that of laughter. Setting aside their quasi-incompatibility, does this mean that they are the whole story? That's the point at which psychotherapy, in any form, breaks down. Not that it doesn't do some good, but it's a good that's a return to what is worse. This is how Lacan presents the side of meaning. A flood of meaning to float the sexual boat in love stories that are hardly comic because they are premised on the belief that oneness exists, and ignorance, willful, passionate, and otherwise, of the non-relation. It doesn't mean that you can't do some good by rushing at the symptom with meaning. It means that the good you do always marks a return to what's worse in the end. Not bad, right? Pretty good introduction to the side of meaning. Let's see if we can hit it again, hit it harder. In psychotherapy, and certainly when psychoanalysis goes astray, as we've discussed, analysts, and sometimes also analysand, rush at symptoms with a flood of meaning, the basic effect of which is twofold. First, when you rush at symptoms with a flood of meaning, you float the sexual boat with love stories and all other sorts of narrative nonsense about how there is indeed such a thing as the sexual rapport. Here is that mystical one Lacan goes on to discuss in section 4 of Television, about that beast with two backs, two halves that when in love become one. Here is that Aristophanic fantasy of love that Plato popularized in the Symposium and that Lacan also references in Television, and which has been making up for the sexual non-rapport ever since. This mystical one that we bandy about in naive, nonsensical love stories has been making up, covering over the sexual non-rapport for thousands of years, and perhaps even longer. Here is that narcissistic love that we railed against in our series on Seminar 20. Again, just following Lacan's lead. The belief that, as Lacan jokes, we are but one. Here again is not the 1 + 1 = 3. That is in many ways the foundational logical mathematical structure of this series, but the fuzzy math that we've been picking apart along the way. 1 + 1 = 1. This is the narrative nonsense perpetrated by love stories designed to float the sexual boat when we rush at symptoms with meanings in hand and in search of more for the other. But it's not the only effect. There's a second effect that happens when we take the side of meaning. And I would just call it yourcening galore. It's not that psychotherapies founded on belief in the one don't do some good. Hear me now. It's that the good they do marks a return to something worse, Lacan says. What's worse than the illusory, fantastical, anything but comic belief in the one? What's worse than the belief that oneness exists? Answer: the misery we experience in its absence. What's worse than belief in the one? The misery we experience in the one's absence, when we're desperately awaiting its arrival and seeking every Susan we can imagine around every corner. The misery in question here, I'd like to reiterate, is not that of the master. The misery in question here is not that of the master, as Miller suggests in his margin note on page 13. Instead, as Lacan specifies, it's that of the capitalist, baby. And it's to this capitalist misery, especially as exacerbated by floods of meaning in the clinic, and sexual boats afloat as a result, that we now need to turn.